What's up, everybody, and what the heck is ISO invariance, and why has it been showing up on my YouTube feed lately? Well, I completely blame Tony Northrup for this whole influx of stuff. I like most of his videos, and basically what happened, he said ISO is make-believe, which it kind of is, and then F-Stoppers replied with a few videos like, you're wrong and you're right. And here's a couple of examples with Nikon. And so I decided I would give my take on it, kind of explain the idea of ISO invariance or ISO invariance. I'm going to be interchanging those two throughout this video. That's not what this is about. Everybody knows what you're talking about, regardless of how you pronounce it. Moving on. So I have not seen a example with Sony cameras yet as far as ISO invariance goes and general noise between different ISOs. And here's a take on something a little older, the Canon 60D. I'm going to be showing you the difference between the ISO invariance or variance with this camera with a couple of Sony cameras here, just so you guys can see how sensor technology has improved and how we're getting closer and closer to ISO-less cameras. So let's go ahead and get some of the confusing stuff out of the way. What is ISO? ISO is basically kind of a standard for brightening your images and how different film used to react to a certain amount of light back in the day. Now we use it as a kind of measurement for the amount of digital gain that is applied to your pictures when you take them. Okay, so when you think of ISO, you think of the higher the ISO goes, the more grainy your images are. While that is true, ISO is not the reason they're grainy. The reason they're grainy is because when you use a high ISO, you let in less light. Let me explain. So if you want a certain image to come out at a given brightness, you select your shutter speed, you select your aperture, and then you select your ISO. So your shutter speed and aperture actually physically let in more light. Your shutter is open for longer, it's got more time to gather more light. You've got a larger aperture, it is bigger, it physically lets a larger volume of light in. You turn up your ISO, nothing changes physically. You're not letting in any more light. And that's the reason that there is more noise. Let me explain. Light is photons. Photons, tiny, tiny little particles coming in through your lens, hitting your sensor in different areas. And when you've got less light, you have less photons. You have less photons as they're coming through and hitting your sensor or your film. Photons hit the sensor in kind of an uneven pattern, especially when there are so few of them. It's kind of like throwing a handful of quarters at something and seeing where they all land. They all land in kind of a different spot. Some of them will be touching, some of them will be several inches apart from each other, but they're kind of scattered randomly, and that's the same thing that photons do on your sensor. So if a specific pixel on your sensor has more photons hit it, it's going to be slightly brighter than those around it, which gives us a contrast. Bright pixel, dark pixel, looks like grain. All right, I've got a quick little example here to try and make this make more sense. I've got the spray paint can in Microsoft Paint. You click once for a quick amount of time, it scatters just a few pixels out there. And they're not all touching each other. And you can see, actually on this very first click, that we've got this little cluster of 3 pixels right here. That may be a bright spot on your image right around all this darker area, which would be translated as grain when you're viewing the image. You click and hold, which is essentially like leaving your shutter open longer, and you can see it lets in a lot more of these pixels in Microsoft Paint. Lets in more photons, which fills up more pixels, and you end up with a smoother image. You can hold for even longer, and you fill in everything, which gives you a very, very low amount of noise. And you leave it open super long or do image stacking or any number of things that is a cumulative exposure, and you'll eventually get rid of almost all the noise. So we've got a ultra low light image right here with lots of noise, and then we've got a super bright image here with very little noise. So if you shoot a picture at ISO 100 with the aperture and shutter speed the exact same as it's shot with ISO 3200, you're going to let in the same number of photons, which is going to net you the same noise pattern. All right, so that's kind of how ISO and noise works. Lets in the same amount of light, the same number of photons, hit the same number of pixels, gives you the same noise pattern, even though you have a brighter image with a higher ISO. So the reason that there's a difference is because when the sensor first gathers those photons and it charges them up to give them a specific RGB value, is then translated from that analog physical reception to a digital signal to go back to the sensor to be processed. I believe, now I could be wrong here, but I believe that the ISO value is applied at the front end there before that initial transcoding. So during that transcoding process, it gives each pixel its ISO value, which 3200 in this case, and brightens it up to that given amount and then transfers it to a digital signal. But some cameras aren't very good at preserving what was there before the analog to digital conversion. The better that conversion is, the more ISO-less your camera becomes. So let's jump in and take a look at a few examples here to see what kind of difference has been made since the 60D came out to when the A6500 came out, and I've also got the A7 III. I've also thrown in a JPEG image here just so you guys can see how this won't work with anything but RAW files. I shot images at ISO 3200 and at ISO 100 with the exact same shutter speed and aperture. I ran those RAW files through Lightroom as well as through Capture One, and here are the results. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom first. So this is the A6500 at ISO 3200. And as you can see, there's a grain pattern back here, but it's not too bad. It's certainly not unpleasant to look at. It's actually very smooth. So let's get into where we can see a few pixels. And now let's turn on the ISO 100 boosted in Lightroom 5 stops. And you can see there's a little bit of a red tint to it, but all things considered, it looks nearly identical. We zoom out just a smidge. There's just a tiny bit of additional brighter, whiter pixels, but in general, very close. A little bit of color correction here. You could get that red tint out of it, but in general, very, very close. Now let's go ahead and look at the Capture One. So in Capture One, you can't actually boost it by the full 5 stops. You can only boost it by the 4 stops, but let's still take a look and see what happened. It actually turns even more red than the one out of Lightroom. As you can see here, that's significantly more of a red hue compared to the Lightroom one that I already thought looked red. So while there's a difference, you see these bigger chunks of noise in the background here. I don't know if it looks particularly any better. It may look better from further away, but when you're right up on it, it doesn't look any better than the Lightroom version. All right, let's go ahead and go to the A7 III. All right, so here's the original A7 III image, and let's just go ahead and zoom right on into where we can see some noise. And this is ISO 3200. This camera is one of the best low light performing cameras I've ever used, and like there's almost no noise back here. What the heck? All right, so let's go ahead and turn on the A7 III out of Lightroom, coming from ISO 100. So there's a pretty significant amount of noise added in there from the ISO 100 version compared to the 3200. I mean, it just looks so good. How's it even possible? I would argue that this one looks... Okay, I'm floored at how good this image looks at ISO 3200. I don't even know what to say. ISO 100 isn't even close. What are you doing with your life? So you can see that it adds, when you boost this image here, for that many stops, you can see, again, it added a lot more little white dots like the A6500. It doesn't look any worse than the A6500, though. Let's see here. In fact, I think it still looks better than the A6500. Definitely darker blacks in the background. This is a totally black background here. But the one straight out of camera is just crazy good. Are you kidding me? All right, so I went through and checked these files just to make sure I had everything right. There's no noise reduction. In fact, the first version of it had sharpening put on it, which should have made the background look even worse, but it didn't somehow. I'm pretty shocked. All right, so that was it. So that was out of Lightroom. Let's look at the Capture One. And again, we've got these bigger, blotchier red spots here that aren't apparent in the original image and are not even apparent in the Lightroom version here. There is more general noise in the Lightroom version of it, but in the Capture One, you can see that there's just a little bit more chunky noise going on. Also check out the what happens when you try to do a JPEG image, the same thing, underexposed by 5 stops and then bring it back in post with a JPEG, and this is what it looks like here. Oof, oh, it hurts to look at. I mean, as you can see, the JPEG compression really does a number on this. Really does a number on this. Oof, it's bad. All right, moving on. All right, so this one is the most interesting here. This is the 60D by Canon, and this camera came out in 2010, so nearly 10 years ago is how old this camera technology is. So let's take a look and see how it does. It's shot at 3200, and you can see about the same amount of noise as one of the boosted images from Sony. It gets really bad when you open up the ISO 100 version that's been boosted and you take a look at that. Oof! Let's go back and forth real quick again. Oof! It's bad. All right, so let's zoom out and you can see just how rough this looks. It looks like a plaid shirt in there. It's crazy. So we can zoom out a little bit further and you can just see this nasty banding horizontally and vertically everywhere in the image when you try and boost it this much. This sensor got the exact amount of light in both of these images, but the technology in the sensor and the processor in the camera, the way that it processes that original data, destroys it and binds it to the ISO that you set it at when you shot your image. So if you're shooting on an older camera that's 2010 before, probably more like 2014 or before, you want to be very careful about shooting at the proper ISO because you will not be able to recover it nearly as well if it doesn't have the best information to work with, which the best information is the analog data right off of the front of the sensor. Let's see if Capture One did any better of a job. It's a little darker because, again, Capture One can't bring it back the full 5 stops. But as you can see, it's got the blotchy red in it everywhere, and it looks pretty much just as bad, just a slightly darker version of just as bad. Okay, so thanks for watching. Hopefully this video shed some light on how newer sensor technology affects ISO, which affects grain, and how they all kind of link together, and how it's actual physical light coming through the front of the camera that makes a difference in these newer sensors here. And it's really nice to see how apparent that is with these ISO-less cameras, that you can pretty much, if it's got the original information coming straight through the lens, you can bring it back in post. So there's lots of forgiveness there, but I would always recommend try and get as much light into your sensor as you can, because there's no compensating for real physical photons hitting your sensor, whether that be with your shutter speed, lowering that, or your aperture, getting that as big as possible. So if you learned something in this video, hit that like button, go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace. I never do that. Why did I say peace? Oh, who cares? Bye.